Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Prayer begins in our desire, but it concludes in our faith. In a moving tribute for the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible, a local newspaper in Nebraska referred to an incident from the Second World War. In the spring of 1940, the German army was plowing through France despite the help from more than 300,000 British troops. Finally, the Germans surrounded and trapped most of the Allied forces in Dunkirk. It appeared that the Allied army would face annihilation or surrender. Eventually, though, a miraculous outpouring of courage allowed the British who looked hopeless, to organize an amazing flotilla of little ships that evacuated almost all of those 300,000. Before the evacuation, at one point when everything looked utterly hopeless, a British officer sent the following message: "But if not." At the time, it was a strong message of courage and of ultimate hope in the midst of trouble. The message conveyed that the British would stand defiantly against the Nazis and that God would provide a way through the dark night. The Nebraska newspaper went on to explain the background of the three-word message, "But if not," which comes straight from the Bible. As the prophet Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced the fiery furnace in Daniel chapter 3, they refused to go down to defeat. Instead, they declared that they had trust in God, even if the mission failed. According to Daniel 3:17 and 18, they said, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto you, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." But if not, those words still speak to our hearts today. But if not, words of hope and courage when the world seems dark and hopeless. But if not, words to live by, words to die by. In circumstances that make little sense, our prayers begin with the circumstances, but think about it, they conclude with our faith. Whatever that looks like, that's how they conclude. The New Testament faith is not one of bargaining. Lord, if you do this, I will do such. But it is submission to God's will even when we cannot understand what he is doing. I want to start this morning with the words of the psalmist. "Out of the depths I call to you, O Lord. Lord, listen to my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for help." Now I want you to think about appealing to God in normal times. These are not normal times, but I want you to remember normal times. Our prayers are often about things. Lord, this is what I desire. Please fulfill my desires. When things are no longer normal, those desires change. Very few of us yesterday evening at 5 o'clock were thinking, Lord, I need a new remote for my television. It didn't seem important. Things had changed. Things no longer meant what they once did. For those who went through the tornado yesterday, what a blessing it is to lose a car and not a family member. We pray for a change in circumstances. Lord, improve my circumstances. Give me good fortune, Lord. But again, the circumstances change, and our faith is not built upon the things we have or the circumstances we find ourselves in. That is not faith yet. In normal times, we also ask God for change. Change me, or maybe more importantly, change my husband, or my wife, or my child, or my boss. Change the politician in office. Change the politician's adversary. But when everything changes in our world, when everything seemingly falls apart, it's then that faith is led, having begun with desire, to open up itself to the sovereign power of God at work. Now we begin the story from our gospel this way. Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus, Lazarus, our brother whom you love, is sick. In fact, not only sick, but he's at the point where they don't know if he's going to pull through or not. And it tells us specifically in the gospel lesson that Jesus loved Mary and Martha, and he loved Lazarus. But he does something that doesn't quite G in our mind. It says that once he heard that he was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Knowing the urgency of the matter, how could he do such? And so by the time that Jesus did arrive, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha trying to comfort them. Yet, their brother was dead. It is at such moments that we cry in anguish to God. Someone once told me that how can I grieve if I'm a Christian? And I have to tell you there's only one answer. Grieve as a Christian. Grief is not given to us as something that other people experience. Death means to us the loss of extraordinary relationships, of people we care about, that we want to be beside us. For those who we have deeply loved who are no longer with us, we don't stop wanting them to be with us. But as Christians, we do not grieve without hope. We grieve in the hope of what God has promised. So in coming into the city, here is Martha, and she hears that Jesus is coming. She goes outside the town to meet him. Mary stays where she is, and Martha says to Jesus, Lord, if only, I want you to stop with those 2 words, if only. My complaints to God have often began with the words, if only, as if God let something slip up on him and go by him without his consideration. If only you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But she also speaks words of faith. Yet I know that even now, whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Not knowing exactly what that meant, but her faith was proclaiming those words. She goes back and says, Mary, he's outside the town, and Jesus waits for her. She comes, and you notice that she says the same words, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Christians are people of the promise. And Mary came with the same words as Martha, but Mary and Martha both have a greater hope. And Martha is the one who puts it into words. When Jesus says he will rise again, Martha says, I know he will rise in the resurrection at the last day. She believed in what God was going to do in the future. That's where we begin as Christians, but it is not where we stop as Christians. Because Christians are a people of a present reality, a reality that the resurrection is not something that is reserved for the future, but is only fully understood in the future. Jesus says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. I will almost lay 2-to-1 odds that the last time you heard that text, if it wasn't right around Easter, was at a funeral. And to me, there's a little bit of shame in that we look at this text as being only about what happens once we die, rather than something that begins while we live. Because we already live in the present reality of the resurrection. Still, the question is, where is God in this? That's the if only of Martha. That's the if only of Mary. That's the if only of those who saw. That's the if only of those who saw Jesus weep. The question is, why do we suffer? Why do others suffer? If you want to know about suffering, there is no greater place in the Bible than to begin with Job. When people talk about the patience of Job, the first thing in their mind, Lord, do not put me in Job's shoes. Hear these words from Job 3, verses 20 through 26 in the paraphrase the message. Why does God bother giving light to the miserable? Why bother keeping bitter people alive? Those who want in the worst way to die and who can't imagine anything better than death, who count the day of their death and burial the happiest day of their life. What's the point of life when it doesn't make sense? When God blocks all the roads to meaning? Instead of bread, I get groans for my supper, then leave the table and vomit my anguish. The worst of my fears has come true, and what I dreaded most has happened. My response is shattered, my peace destroyed. No rest for me ever. Death has invaded my life. The reality of life in a suffering world means there's sometimes those words of Job are in our own mouths. The story of Job is not just one of abandonment, but is hope in the midst of abandonment. Therefore, cast all your cares on him because he cares for you, is what Peter says in the 5th chapter of his first epistle. And the Apostle James says, blessed is the one who endures trials. And he goes on to say, no one undergoing a trial should say, I'm being tempted by God, because God is not tempted by evil, and he himself doesn't tempt anyone. This is where we come to a short-sighted theology. That we believe that everything that confronts us, God has authored. Hear me carefully, lest you think I jump very quickly into heresy. God is never the author of evil. But because of the providential care of God, evil never can thwart or have the last word over God. when Jesus says all things work together for those who love him, those who he's called according to his purposes, what the promise is that even evil, though God doesn't author it, God can overpower it and use even evil for his good. Short-sighted theology has the following problems. First of all, short-sighted theology can believe that God cannot act, that God is powerless in our world, that perhaps he is the first mover, but he has abandoned all hands-on relationships in our world, and such a God doesn't care about this life a bit. If that were true, he would not have come in the incarnation. The second thing that short-sighted theology might say is that God will not act even though he could. It is kind of what a parent does in exasperation. They made their own bed, they can now sleep in it. The third thing perhaps is the most egregious and invasive, that God will not act without our doing certain magical things. That God won't act unless we do the following 3 steps to having God act in your life. The following ritual or actions. But he came as the promised healer. The prophet Isaiah said, "How will you know the Messiah? The eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will sing for joy. Water will gush in the wilderness and streams in the desert." This is how you will know. So we come as those in need. We never know quite what's going to happen in our life. Yesterday at 4 o'clock, I was telling Mike earlier, at 4 o'clock I left this church and I drove down Highland past a mall that was whole, and then by an airport that was open. I had my sunroof open for most of that trip until it started dripping a little bit. 2 hours later, we drive past the airport because, you just can't stop a pastor from checking on the church after a storm. And the airport looked like it had been through an air attack. And it had. We never know when we're going to be in need, and we can't understand everything that happens. And all you have to do is look in our city today and see the damage, and then remark 6 people injured, 2 in stable condition, the rest treated and released. And you have to say, God's hand is still upon this city and this people, and he still does marvelous things in our sight. Because we are people of the promise, we recognize that. We also recognize that the life Jesus gives is not reserved for the end. That we are people who have confidence. First of all, we have confidence in the resurrection at the end times. Our letter of Ezekiel this morning says, "I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them." And if we did not get it the first time, he again says, when I open your graves and bring you up from them, I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Here is the promise that not only is there a future, but in that future, all of these things that now hold you hostage, they will end. And the last thing to be destroyed is death itself. Jesus is the life giver. Put your hope in the Lord, for there is His faithful love with the Lord and with him is redemption in abundance. Jesus said to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. We place our hope in the author of hope. But he is also Lord of the present. Our prayers are abundantly answered. Anselm, one of the first great leaders of the church in England, says, God does not delay to hear our prayers because he has no mind to give, but that by enlarging our desires he may give us the more largely. Your prayers are too small. How true that is. Our prayers are too small. We pray about little things when God has before us the great things. And now the destroyer of death acts. Here we are in the heart of this gospel lesson. Jesus is moved deeply. And we cannot even exegete properly that one simple verse of 2 words, Jesus wept. It is beyond us. We can find plenty of people to answer it for us, but it is beyond us because it is such an extraordinary text itself. But Jesus then goes on to say, remove the stone. Now Martha has some questions about this. Lord, he has the death stench about him. Lord, he's already deteriorating. Didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? I don't know what you answer at that point if you're Martha. I'm not sure if you expect the smell or the glory. But we're not told what Martha thought at the moment, because Jesus simply prays to the Father at this moment. Father, I thank you that you heard me. I know that you always hear me, but because of this crowd here that is gathered, I want them to understand that it is you who sent me. And after the prayer, he doesn't speak softly. He shouts out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! And the whole crowd were absolutely gobsmacked. Because here comes out Lazarus as if he's in a B-rated horror movie. Think about it. He's coming out wrapped in the linen strips, in his grave attire. And all that Lazarus thinks at this moment is, there is my Lord. But secondly, will somebody not take me out of these grave clothes? And Jesus said, unwrap him. He is free. Let him go. Faith calls us to the Lord of resurrection. We have our confidence in him. At the end of the day, in a time in which people are worried about a virus, medicine will not cure everything that can kill us. At the end of the day, what you have accumulated, you will not get to keep. I know he didn't originate it, but I can remember Billy Graham saying, I've never seen a hearse with a U-Haul trailer carrying someone's possessions behind. in everything that you've accomplished, all the fame, all the fortune, everything that you have accumulated in this life will become a fading memory. And one more thing, Jesus does not always grant the healing we desire. That's not a failure of faith, but it's the greater truth that what God has before us is greater than what God has already let us see. The empty tomb is no longer a place of sadness, but it is now the place of celebration, no longer a place of death, but now it is the place of life, in the present and in our future. I want to end with a play. I'm not going to give you the whole play, just a brief outtake. It's early in his career, and the American playwright Eugene O'Neill wrote an imaginative play entitled Lazarus Laughed. It's about Lazarus' life beginning after Jesus raises him from the dead. Now, at the beginning of the play, guests from Bethany are gathered for a banquet in Lazarus' honor. They're all desperate to hear what Lazarus has to say about his experience. And wouldn't you want to hear that yourself? They take their seats, and one guest says, "The whole look of his face has changed. He is like a stranger from a far land. There is no longer any sorrow in his eyes. They must have forgotten sorrow in the grave." Another guest, who had helped roll the tombstone aside, recalls the scene after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead in even more beautiful terms. And then Lazarus knelt and kissed Jesus' feet, and both of them smiled. And Jesus blessed him and called him my brother, and went away. And Lazarus, looking after him, began to laugh softly, like a man in love with God. Such a laugh I never heard. It made my ears drunk. It was like wine. And though I was half dead with fright, I found myself laughing